Welcome everyone, and thanks for joining us at our session. Today we're talking about advanced work packaging, making the leap from theory to reality. This is a breakout session. While we've got some content to cover, our goal is really to make this quite interactive. So we do ask you throughout the presentation, post your comments, questions to the Q&A box. We're going to keep an eye on them as we work our way through the presentation. If it makes sense to answer them kind of in line with some of the content, we'll do that to make sure that we get through everything. Everything else we'll hold till the end of the presentation. We'll certainly answer it there. So a couple of logistics. The presentation format, like I said, it's going to be pretty dynamic. There's two presenters today, Joe and myself. So we're going to kind of pass the microphone, the virtual microphone, if you will, back and forth. We're going to talk a little bit about the theory, and we're going to talk about the practice. So Joe and I are going to work together as we work our way through the content. And like I said, we do intend it to be interactive, so we will take some of those questions in line if it makes sense at the timing of the question to cover it then. So some quick introductions to get us started. For those that don't know us, we want to make sure you get to know us. We want to get to know you when we get to the Q&A section as well. So we look forward to talking to you then. My name is Tanis Leviniak. I'm the president of Trillium Advisory Group. For those who aren't familiar with us, we are a construction consultancy. We provide services and support for AWP and digital initiatives, including analytics, machine learning, BIM, which includes 4D and 5D planning, as well as digital twinning. I have 20 years of experience in the construction industry, and I've been in the AWP and workplace planning space for just a little over 15 years now, so quite a while. My focus areas personally are digital project delivery, advanced work packaging, analytics, machine learning, and artificial intelligence. And with that, Joe, I'll hand it over to you.
Thanks, Tanis. So my name is Joe Rondone. I'm kind of occupying dual role right now. I'm the corporate AWP manager for Zachary Group, but I'm also the AWP manager for a large mega project, EPC. I've been in construction now just over 27 years. My focus area is, of course, advanced work packaging here, project management, execution planning, and also try to really get people to effectively communicate with each other. What I'm going to be my perspective is from the constructor. Even though I'm the AWP manager for the EPC project, I think what I'm going to really try to do here is offer our tools and disciplines, some things that we've implemented so that we move from maybe how AWP originally started as focusing in on the construction portion of work with workplace planners. We're really trying to take that spotlight and move it upstream more into the E&P space, and even offer some things that maybe you've got to be aware of or work with the owner to make the overall project much more successful rather than just kind of looking at construction. So with that, Tanis, let's go ahead and get started.
Sounds good. Thanks, Joe. All right, so why this topic? There's been a lot of great presentations during the conference, and the comment has been made a few times, you know, the real world examples, those case studies, those implementation stories really provide so much value to those that are out there making AWP happen on projects. And that's really where we wanted to focus our attention today is, you know, there's lots of theory out there, there's lots of resources, but in practice, sometimes things look a little bit different. And sometimes theory and practice, there's a bit of a divergence between the two. And that's necessary as far as getting a project executed, getting things accomplished, and really putting AWP principles in play that will positively impact the outcome of the project. So Joe and I really wanted to spend some time today talking about the practice and the reality of advanced work packaging, provide some insights and stories and also some tools and takeaways for you so that you can take those out and action them on your projects, whether current or future. All right, so we're going to work our way through the project lifecycle, starting out with engineering. So we're going to talk about engineering, procurement, and construction. We do have quite a bit of content to get through, so we're going to move relatively quickly. So like I said, if you do have questions, please post them to the Q&A section. All right, so engineering in theory. For teams that are just starting out with their AWP journey, or some that have been on the journey for a while, the theory of it really centers around the development and delivery of engineering work packages, or EWPs, to construction. Everybody focuses on that. That really is the core deliverable that everybody centers in on. But if you've noticed through some of the presentations over the last couple days, yesterday and today, there's been a lot of discussion around data requirements and all of the other things that engineering does in order to successfully deliver a project. And all of that information is also required. We've seen some cool tools and software and applications that really help teams deliver on advanced work packaging. Those applications don't work without the data that drives them. So in reality, the focus of engineering teams is really much broader. And while the engineering work package is the deliverable that gets handed over, there's still data requirements that need to be actioned, and they need to be formalized and defined in order for teams to effectively execute project delivery through procurement, construction, into commissioning, and project closeout. So there's mountains of data that need to be produced, and it's important that the team really centers in on that. Now, one thing to keep in mind is we talk about the path of construction and the path of engineering, and fundamentally those are very different. Now, in theory, we talk about aligning them, and it's important that engineering supports what construction needs, and conceptually that makes a lot of sense. But the challenge with that is the way we design is not the way we build, and vice versa. We design by system, we build by area, and so translating those two and driving alignment can sometimes be quite challenging. So think of it this way: engineering is really marching down a path that's laden with trees and brush, and they're clearing the way for procurement and construction to come along behind them. In reality, they need to be far enough ahead that procurement and construction can be effective and continue down that path without having things in their way. But that alignment really can be quite challenging. And I know Joe's going to talk about some specifics, but one of the key things to keep in mind is really that front loading of resources in engineering is quite critical. A lot of teams really underestimate how early and how fast engineering needs to ramp up in order to support those downstream deliverables. So in theory, the concept of producing EWP seems quite straightforward. In reality, there's a lot of complexity here, and we need to get it right, because if we don't get engineering right, the downstream activities, certainly there's impacts there. And we've heard a lot of good content over the last couple of days around how to focus that effort on engineering, what's required for data. I know CII has done a lot of great work there as well. But it really is important that we focus attention on the holistic deliverables for engineering and not just that engineering work package. All right, Joe, over to you.
Yeah, Janice, that's a great lead-in. So I'll try to offer maybe some practical things here. And again, this is based on current experience with this large EPC mega project that we're working on. As a constructor, we're all comfortable. We're all not comfortable all the time, but we're all familiar with the pressure, sometimes unwanted, that comes from the owner. They're looking at us to see what kind of resources we have. Are we meeting our starts and finish dates? How are we moving towards? How are we working on our critical path? Is the end date moving? A lot of pressure gets brought to bear during that construction phase. What we suggest is the owner can really play a large, crucial part in driving similar accountability during the engineering phase, right? The owner can support, can push for constructability input into the design to ultimately make the project buildable when it comes time to start the construction phase, and also can impart onto engineering a sense of urgency. And by no means do I mean this to be an attack or a push on engineering, but rather to again accentuate or emphasize what Tanis mentioned earlier about the critical role that engineering plays in the overall project life cycle and how they can support AWP. Engineering needs to ensure they have the right resources early enough to make positive progress. Just like I said a minute ago, like construction, the engineering schedule should be resource loaded to ensure the necessary work can be accomplished at the right times. One thing I want to bring in is that the engineering's got to focus on the priorities and the path of engineering that supports the path of construction. As we're getting more and more familiar with AWP, the path of construction really sets out the overall drive and key areas that engineering, that procurement, that construction, and ultimately commissioning need to work on. And in order to achieve that, I suggest that we be mindful, the project becomes mindful of focused EWP completion as opposed to gross engineering document progress. What I'm saying here is maybe this is elementary to most folks, but it's turned out to be a very powerful tool. Consider using skylines for your EWPs rather than S-curves to highlight out of sequence progress and late or missed EWPs. So Tanis, if you'll go to the next slide. Just kind of as an example here, I'm sure most people are familiar with that traditional S-curve on the left. And a lot of times, imagine it says, instead of EWP finish, that it says engineering % complete, which is typically based on document progress. A lot of times we see that engineering is progressing well. Their rules of credit are based on IFR documents, IFC documents, vendor prints coming in, and they tend to get ahead of schedule or at least look well. And that's what I'm going to call traditional progress. But if you look to the right in more of a skyline format here, time is going left to right. And as you can see in this example where we have greens, those are actually accepted EWPs, meaning that construction has something they can actually work on. Their documents are IFC. If there's a requirement for PE stamping, that's been accomplished. These are things that actually construction can work on. And what you'll notice there is that to the left of the red line being the current data date, there's still quite a few EWPs in white, meaning they have not submitted and or they're missing information. They're not yet at complete, meaning again, that construction is not ready to work on them, nor can QC buy off on them. Now look to the right of the red line, early data, or means that we're getting progress early. If we're not looking in a skyline format, that promotes the feeling when we look at a traditional S-curve that everything's okay. We're on schedule. Our planned % complete is matched up with our current % complete, and therefore our forecast is good. But again, there's a lot of effort that's been done to tie the into EWPs, ultimately PWPs. I'm going to introduce the concept of VWP. Ultimately, that schedule has been built to align to the CWP, the construction, the path of construction. And that focus, just like we have during construction, needs to be applied during the engineering phase as well. We've got to be getting the right packages in the right order to support construction downstream. Go ahead, Tanis.
Thanks, Joe. All right, so moving on to procurement. Now, procurement is difficult, and I think the industry, there's a lot of consensus here. Organizations typically approach procurement quite differently. People have different systems, different processes, and ultimately, getting visibility into what's happening in procurement is the ultimate goal, because if procurement is performing well, we're going to see positive impacts on downstream construction activities. And if things are missing or delayed, then we're going to see late starts on our downstream CWPs and ultimately those installation work packages that are subsequent to that. So in theory, when most people think about procurement work packages or just procurement in general, they think of this one-to-one kind of relationship. Anybody who's worked in the AWP space for a while and has tried to kind of wrangle this procurement concept knows that there's a lot more to it than that. This one-to-one structure just doesn't give you the granularity to really manage those procurement activities and drive the right visibility into what's happening to make good decisions downstream. So as we kind of start working our way into the complexity of this, looking at engineering work package development, as Joe mentioned earlier, it's important that we're targeting the right things at the right time. And even though engineering designs by system, if you think of an EWP as a bucket that needs to be filled up, we need to make sure we're filling those buckets up fast enough to support on-time delivery so that we can then execute our procurement and our construction activities. So we do have some things that are going on typically concurrently. We've got engineering work package development. Engineering is producing requisitions that are going to lead to purchase orders being issued, which then leads to vendor data being produced and sent back to the engineering team. And that's all happening before fabrication and delivery is taking place. Within the industry, those that have been in the space for a while, there's no need to to delve into the details here, but late EWP deliverables are sometimes caused by late vendor data. And vendor data, if not managed at a granular level and really looking at it as a constraint to EWP finalization, it can certainly wreak some havoc on your schedule if it's not a focus point. So it's really important that we get visibility into all of these steps, and you've got that iterative relationship there. But in order to support on-time EWP development, there is some procurement activities that are being handled concurrently. Now, late issuances of purchase orders will certainly cause late vendor data, which will cause a delay in the delivery of the EWP. So it's really important that engineering and procurement teams are working collaboratively here and working together, and also formulating a plan, figuring out when the latest purchase order issue date is to support vendor data being received on time, to support on-time EWP delivery. And that's then going to ensure that we get fabrication and delivery occurring on a timeline that is going to support construction. So Joe mentioned the concept of a VWP, and I'll start to kind of introduce this, and then he's going to provide a lot more detail as we kind of work our way through the content here. But looking at engineering requisitions and then subsequent purchase order issuance, vendor work packages, or VWPs, this is something that I thought was really unique, and something that Joe's going to explain more in detail. But this is a vendor deliverable. This is not taking all of the procurement activities or all of the material and equipment and kind of lumping it together within a single or tied to a single EWP. This is breaking it down more granularly so that your vendors are actually producing and delivering according to their own work packages, being these vendor work packages. So in some cases, you'll have a single purchase order to a single VWP to a single CWP, and that's fine. But in some cases, you can actually break your vendor work scope down into chunks, right? You can have 5 or 6 VWPs that a vendor is going to deliver for a single CWP, and that's really effective if you're looking for staged deliveries. But the real benefit of this approach and getting granular with these vendor work packages is really that you can see what's happening. You can see if vendor work packages are starting early or late because your vendor is reporting against them. So you're getting data on a weekly or a bi-weekly basis, depending on what your schedule reporting requirements are. If you're getting progress at a VWP level, you can get cost at a VWP level. And ultimately, as you're kind of driving your way through that, you can, at a very granular level, see what's happening and use that information to make good decisions. So if you have a VWP that's maybe running a little bit late, maybe shipping is behind, you can then see the push on the CWP activity there, and you can see the impact that it's going to have downstream. And as you are proactive in that approach, and you're seeing what's actually happening, you can make decisions that will positively impact the trajectory of the project. Maybe that means resequencing some work. Maybe that means delaying something and pulling something else ahead. But you can see that and you can affect change before that change becomes a problem on site. And so there's a lot of value in taking procurement and really getting into the weeds and bringing your vendors into the ecosystem and focusing on their involvement and empowering them to help provide good visibility and transparency, and ultimately that's going to lead to predictability in your procurement process. But working your way upstream, it's so important that you get you have a good plan established for purchase order issuance. Engineering and procurement are working very closely together, because without that, all those downstream activities are a lot harder to kind of wrangle back in once things are delayed early on. So again, this is another thing. It's really important that we get this right. Procurement is something that the industry has really struggled with to date. There's lots of software and applications out there that can really help assist with this, but in principle, it just comes down to good planning and good granularity in that planning. All right, Joe, over to you.
Yeah, Janice, actually, I want to add 1 or 2 parts to that one before I jump on that slide. You did a great job laying that out. I think it's kind of a shared practical learning from what we're doing on this project currently. Having these VWPs, of course, is allowing us to more effectively control the fabrication and shipping of pipe and steel. to effectively start our CWPs. We're actually have prevented the fabricators from building for their own efficiency. Their fabrication efforts are much more in line with our construction priorities. As you touched on, there may be some POs that are across different areas. This allows us to really help or sequence for the fabricators what we need, rather than just letting them kind of run their own show. It's not good enough for the vendors and subcontractors to just deliver their agreed to products and scope of work. In some cases, the vendors and subcontractors are actually managing large scopes of work, whether it be on site or in their shops. What we did was make sure that there's language in the POs and contracts spelling out what AWP is and what their role should be. Contractors have spent a lot of time learning about AWP. We're trying to force those learnings again upstream into the E&P. We assign criticality ratings to various pieces of equipment and packages, and also to specific subcontract types. We made deliberate efforts to train vendors and suppliers in AWP. We've had sessions with critical vendors and spelled out the requirements to support AWP during their fabrication and ultimate delivery. And also during those sessions, and you touched on it briefly, we introduced the concept of a vendor work package. Again, the real effort that they've got to expend in order to get us things that we can then build and install. The VWP, or vendor work package, it easily ties deliverables into the overall schedule, through the use of the EWP, CWP nomenclature. The only thing that's changing is that V on the end, the leading letter there to tell you who's responsible for it. It also makes a cleaner tie to see any early impacts of the path of construction, as you said earlier, Candace. And finally, by having the vendors build their schedules into a format that supports the overall construction schedule, we're able to more effectively monitor and manage their performance. One of the big things I've learned about AWP, it's really about visibility. It's about getting everybody speaking the same language. It's reduced those opportunities to kind of work behind the scenes. Everything becomes much more visible. It's in these smaller packages. It's easier to locate potential, or identify first potential problem areas, and then locate specific things that need to be worked on. Let's go to the next one, Candace. So I want to share with you first, I mentioned both procurement and subcontractors. First here, we created we assigned a risk matrix to different pieces of equipment. As you can see here along the top right there, probability risks, we look at items that could have a rapid delivery requirement or a substantial trend of late or out of sequence deliveries. Went through a high risk, medium risk, low risk, and then the consequence of that, high risk being that it could have substantial impact to both to construction cost and or schedule impacts, to a medium risk. And we use that to then assign those ratings to different pieces of equipment to give us an advanced look of where do we need to spend effort early on with those particular vendors and or particular equipment, materials and so forth, packages that we need to spend a lot of attention on early, and be prepared to do that rather than be surprised by that. So let's go to the next one, Tanis, if you don't mind. So what we did there, it's again one thing to assign that criticality, but what we then did, and this is different here, I think in most cases, construction, we typically provide a weekly update cycle, then kind of true up at the end of the month. But each week we're expected to put out a schedule of where we're at, and then forecasting. Many projects, if not all of them, engineering and procurement operate on a monthly cycle. And I would make the argument that a lot of us in construction then become surprised or are reactive to changes when something has been tracking along quite well for a while. And then when it's getting close to the time for delivery and ultimate installation, something arises. So we took those criticality ratings, and what we said is if a vendor is a criticality 1, that they are going to be required to update and submit an updated schedule weekly. Now that did cause some raised eyebrows for those vendors. Definitely not something they're used to. But what it allows us to do, the project, not just construction, but the project, to keep a close eye on what's coming down the pike. Is that vendor struggling? As Tana showed a minute ago, she showed that little graphic where there's kind of a loop going between EWP and vendor prints. And what we also explained to the vendors is this would help them as well. they may be waiting for information to come back from engineering. They may be waiting for their documents to be approved so they can move on into that fab step at the end and ultimate delivery. And if they're not getting that feedback, it could be impacting their schedule as well. So by having that schedule, not only is it allowing the project to understand what's going on, but also provides a vehicle for those vendors to help drive engineering to support them in their ultimate goal to meet that required shipping date. As you look on a criticality 2, what we had there is those vendors that are not as critical, they need to provide an update every month, every 2 weeks. And then the 3s and 4s is more of a traditional style update every month. They're not going to hurt, they're not on the critical path, not going to have as big an impact, and so they can use their typical update cycle. But this, I think, was, or not I think, I know, was a leap forward in how we're trying to take the learnings from construction and AWP and again start applying it up much earlier where you can definitely make an impact, a more positive impact to the project. So let's go to the next one, Tanis. Subcontracts, much like the vendors, we did a similar risk rating here. As you can see there on the probability risk rating, an A is a high risk. There's a probability of late completion based on previous experience. Now, this is where definitely we as constructors have got more experience working with a variety of subcontractors out there, whether it be heavy lift or it be a building that needs to be installed, or it's insulation on cryogenic lines, different things like that. We have looked at medium risk, again, based on previous experience, and then look at the consequences below. High risk that they could have a schedule impact greater than 15 days on the project. Now, on a multi-year project, at first glance, 15 days doesn't seem like a lot, but when we start getting compressed and the pressure gets on, it is important that everybody makes their committed to start and finish dates, and that's why we try to identify this early on. A medium risk, we're looking at those that might impact between 4 and 15 days on the overall project, and then low, those who don't really impact. This would be your non-critical subcontractors. And we didn't apply this to each and every subcontract type. It's again those ones that traditional constructors are working with on site. Again, whether it's a total move-in, move-out EPC subcontractor, like a building subcontractor, or just a straight construction support, like again, insulation being a good one there. Okay, so much like the VWPs for equipment, the critical subcontractors are using SWPs in this case in their schedule. You know, as I mentioned here a minute ago, some of our subcontractors' scope of works are projects in their own right. They can be greater than $100 million in some of these buildings that are being built on larger mega projects. We believe they need to maintain the same rigor as construction does, right? To facilitate this, again, we required our subcontractors to commit to utilizing AWP. And in order to support that, this is where you put it into practice. We actually assigned several planners to support them. We recognized that AWP is new to the industry, or newer to the industry, but especially into subcontracting and engineering. So the only way you're going to make this work is doing that investment up front and actually assigning some planners to work with those subcontractors. We worked with the various subcontractors to develop their schedules and start them in their journey. We would have a group of their folks actually come to the project site and sit down with our planners. We created PowerPoint presentations to walk them through and explaining AWP at the high level and then what their specific requirements are. Going back to this criticality rating, you see that 1, it means that the subcontractors must utilize IWPs, much like constructors have to. We require them to use the IWPs in their schedule and also to demonstrate effective constraint management. Those subcontractors have got to be held to the same standards and discipline that construction uses. If you're ensuring that their constraints are being managed, I think as a contractor, you are mitigating potential problems, avoiding potential change orders later on, providing a better understanding of how their work is going to be incorporated into your overall schedule. I think you can earlier identify any kind of conflict areas where you may need to deconflict and resequence some work whether it be on the subcontractor or the contractor. But again, ultimately, that's bringing much more visibility. With criticality 2, what we did there was they had to use at least a CWP or SWP in their schedule. They didn't need to go down to the IWP level. That was their choice. But again, it was that upfront effort in order to identify these early on and avoid surprises later. As you start focusing in areas, it's much more effective management can be brought to bear rather than reactive part. So I'll stop there, Tanis. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Joe. Question has come in. It's probably a good time to table it. So with the constrained global supply chain, lots of materials and equipment have become critical. So what disciplines or applications would vendor packages be most effective for?
Say that one more time.
Yeah, so the constraints in the global supply chain, things are delayed and late. So some materials and equipment are becoming quite critical or are quite critical to get to site to keep schedules on time.
Right.
So do you have any recommendations on what disciplines vendor work packages should be used for, or should they be used for all disciplines?
Yeah, so vendor work packages, now it's clear. So we use them, of course, on large, say, rotating equipment, large static equipment, any type of packages that had to be brought, whether it's electrical buildings where you've got different vendors and sub-vendors working together to ultimately deliver a PDC. We use vendor work packages there. We also use vendor work packages on pipe and steel. And I hit that a minute ago. Going back in my project history on a previous mega project, there's a lot of pipe spools that need to be delivered, but what we found was that the fabricator, they're interested in running their shops efficiently, and so a lot of straight run pipe starts coming first. Small bore starts coming, but you don't need that stuff yet. You may require some of the more complex pipe, larger pipe, to arrive on site early. And we did not do a good job on that earlier mega project of explaining or laying out for those vendors what we required and when we required it. Again, we've traditionally kind of sat back and said, we've placed our order, we've given them an end date, we trust they're going to deliver it. The VWPs overcome that trust factor, and now you're managing and expediting where you need to be. I'll pick on an example again about pipe. The pipe for a particular CWP, of course, is going to be made up of straight run pipe of various sizes, probably various systems, since we're starting by area versus system-based construction. But by having those VWPs, we know specific valves or specific flanges, specific items that are being impacted by this global supply chain epidemic that we're going through because of the pandemic and others. So we're able to then to start looking at going from the pipe CWP to a pipe IWP and understand which particular IWP may be impacted. Is the new forecasted date for those particular pieces within the VWP still support the IWP, even though they may not make the CWP start date? So kind of wrap up there. Your big pieces of equipment, your rotating pieces, big packages that have got sub-vendors involved, and I suggest pipe and steel. I hope that's clear there, Tanis.
Perfect. Thanks, Joe.
Sure.
Just touching on that as well. When it comes to vendor reporting for those critical pieces of equipment, even though they're providing schedule updates for VWPs, those subtasks that they're breaking out within their own plans, they can have 10, 15 tasks assigned to a VWP and a schedule that they're tracking as well. So that additional granularity below the VWP as kind of a hammock gives you great insight into, as Joe mentioned, where some of the hangups are. If they've run into issues with, getting approvals, or they're dealing with some other challenge that's causing that VWP to be delayed, you can see that. And as those schedule updates are coming in weekly, ultimately the project team has great visibility into what's happening and where to focus attention. And that's really the great part about having the granularity in your project plans and really having visibility of what's going on, is you can focus conversations in the right areas and be targeting things that really need to be addressed, rather than looking at things holistically and then trying to figure out where the challenges are. So really provide some great insight there. And with that data, you can also do good dashboarding, right? And the use of visualization tools and really taking all of the data that's being produced on a project and the larger the project, the more data you have. Actioning that data is really critical, and empowering team members to make good decisions requires making good use of that data. So through those BWPs and by working with your vendors to get better insight into what's really going on, you can drive visibility in a way that you can't when you don't have that level of granularity and that detailed information that they're providing. All right, so moving on to construction next, we did have another question that came in. We started with engineering. Why didn't we start with project setup? And the answer to that question is there's just not enough time. So with a 1-hour breakout session, we really tried to get tactical in some of the conversations that we were having. There's lots more that Joe and I would have liked to cover, but in an hour, it's just there's not enough time to work our way through the entire project lifecycle. But I certainly do encourage attendees, if you have questions about project setup, commissioning and completions, or anything we didn't get to in this session, please reach out and talk to us directly. We'll certainly be around the conference for the remainder of the day, or you can get in contact with us and we'd be happy to answer your questions. All right, so moving on to construction. Joe talked a little bit about the path of construction earlier. We talked about aligning the path of engineering and the path of construction and the challenges that can create, right? If we don't have good planning development early in the project, if that resource loading of the schedule isn't complete, if we're not staffing up early enough to support engineering and procurement activities, the path of construction can become a little bit complicated, right? If we are running into things that are impacting that in a negative way. So in theory, you guys are likely familiar with this, but for those that are newer to AWP, starting out with defining our construction work areas, then breaking those down into construction work packages, so CWPs, sequencing those CWPs and figuring out what is the optimal way to execute this scope of work that's going to have the most positive impact on the project outcome. Now, in theory, that sounds really straightforward, but anybody who's worked on a very large project can tell you in practice, this is very challenging because you start dealing with quite a large volume of data. When you're looking at construction work packages, say you have 2,000 of them. Now, trying to sequence 2,000 work packages, you can do it. You can put a schedule together, get all the logic built in, and then something changes, and now you're moving things around and trying to get visibility into that, and it can be incredibly complicated. And the more packages you have, the more complicated that becomes. But it's so critical that we get this right, because without a solid path of construction that the whole project team buys into, you're going to end up with front-end misalignment that's not going to support the downstream construction activities. But also, if that path of construction is inaccurate, things are out of sequence, you're going to have a much harder time as you start realizing that, and then have to start moving things around. So it's so critical that teams invest in developing a path of construction that really is solid. We heard through some presentations over the last couple of days that teams have spent a lot of time in workshops developing this, and it's important that you have the right stakeholders in the room. Much as the name implies, it's important that you have construction representation there, and that sounds very straightforward, but I still continue to hear stories about people developing a path of construction without construction stakeholders present, and it's critical that we get this right. So we do need a high level of engagement as we're developing the path of construction, and it is incredibly difficult to do in Gantt charts, because as you're trying to engage those stakeholders, visualizing 2,000 work packages in a Gantt chart can become quite complicated. And that's really where digital solutions come in. So the sequence matters, investing in getting it right matters. Anybody who's tried to do this in a Gantt chart, I mean, yes, you can, but it's really difficult to identify out of sequence work. And this is where 4D planning creates a lot of value. So teams can view the work before they do the work and ultimately get that sequence right. And it's interesting to watch teams take their planned path of construction, put it in a 4D model, do a playback, and people will kind of jump out of their seats and say, wait a minute, there's pipe hanging in the air there and there's no steel to be seen. Now that's in a schedule that the construction team has already reviewed. But when you put it in a 4D model and play it back, you'll find things that you won't see in a Gantt chart, because it's just easier to see in a 3D model. So the technology solutions that are out there can really help you with the development of a path of construction that's solid and that the team buys into. It's also great for developing what-if scenarios and doing refinements on that path of construction, because you'll look at things like equipment placement and heavy equipment and critical lifts and things like that. Sometimes you'll find that the sequence makes sense, but you're going to end up with inaccessibility or high area congestion because of the activities that are going on in the way they've been sequenced. So you can see things in 4D that you can't see in a Gantt chart. And so there's a lot of value in using some of those digital tools to really help refine that path of construction and make sure that we get it right. All right, Joe, over to you.
Yeah, so Tanis, that was a great segue. You and I worked together on this project, and I saw those 4Ds that you put together, and it's amazing to be able to see how that project's actually going to be built, that conversion from P6 into a visual, right? And if you'll remember, we spent a lot of time also linking E and P to that construction video, right, to see how things are going to be built. And folks were committed to it. But you know, when reality arises, there's a tendency to revert to traditional methods, what we're all used to doing. I'm going to kind of lead into here. I've got an example that I'm going to bring up. You said it, and I'm going to repeat it again. The project team, and I'm not saying constructor, I'm saying the project team has to remain committed to the path of construction. And that path of construction defines the path of procurement and the path of engineering as well, right? There was a lot of time and effort expended to develop that, and it provides that roadmap to where pressure should be exerted. In this case, exerted very early in the overall project, not just the construction window. The constructor has got to resist the temptation to develop workarounds early in the engineering and procurement phase. And I'll just share an example from the project, Tanis, if that's okay. We started seeing about a year and a half ago, prior to some of these CWPs that were about to start piping, that some valves were going to be late. They're already projecting them to be late. And the owner immediately asked construction, what's construction going to do about it? And I remember sitting in that meeting, and my reply was nothing. E&P has the responsibility right now to finish the procurement effort and begin the expediting efforts. And I didn't say that to be facetious or to not work with them. What I've learned here is AWP, again, it's not just for construction, it's for the E&P as well, and it helps keep that spotlight early on. It takes a lot less resources to expedite those vendors early on, in this case, a year and a half in advance, to get that done, rather than doing a lot of workarounds during the construction phase, which a lot of us get faced with. You know, the owner definitely has a part to play, but we need to remind them again of that full path, maybe project path, rather than just path of construction, so they can apply that pressure early and in the right areas, rather than immediately jumping to the end phase. You've got to keep the overall project in mind. Again, far too often we jump ahead to see what construction can do to, quote, save the day. Construction may save the day, but they're sure not going to save any money or time. Again, keeping up with that valve example above, expediting efforts were able to secure the valves in time. And I touched on this a minute ago. You know, maybe we didn't meet the CWP start date, but because we started planning out IWPs, we were able then to get a good forecast and a good commitment of when that valve would actually land. And it allowed us to keep working in that north to south path of construction that we initially set with those 4D models and everything else. And that allowed us to continue to move on. You know, if we didn't expedite those valves early and continuously, construction would have spent a lot of money to install them at a later date. Consider, you know, that the cost of scaffolding and valve installation after the work has progressed, it can be 7 times as much as when you're installing from north to south or in line. If you have to come back in and remobilize equipment, remobilize a crane, now do a lot of bull rigging to get a large valve into a tight spot when it was supposed to fit there originally, it's worth that time and effort to spend it early on. Can construction afford to spend this? Can the project afford to do this? I would argue no. And again, that's why it's so important to keep that spotlight and keep monitoring those individual EWPs and VWPs in order to support the downstream CWPs so that the project can be erected according to that nice picture you showed a minute ago when we're doing the 4D stuff. Now, granted, the owner's got a major vested interest in the project. What I'm suggesting here is just keep reminding them of the AWP principles early and often. as I said a minute ago, and I'll repeat it, AWP is really about redirecting that spotlight towards early EMP efforts so that construction and commissioning can do their work rather than kind of work a miracle. We got to get out of that mode, Tanis. So that kind of closes my part there. I'm sure we'll get a question or two on that as we come in. And then lastly, I wanted to kind of touch on the idea of constraint management. Not using any specific system or product out in the market. What I'm urging here is that when we do start looking into construction, that we resist the temptation to over-assign. I suggest that we focus on these four main that we have here, right? The EWP, is the EWP projected to be ready according to schedule skyline dates? Or is it at least far enough in advance that the CWP start date can support proper IWP planning? Keep an eye on those EWPs using those skyline charts to get a good forecast of what's happening. Are you getting the right stuff? If not, start chasing them down, whether you're using your war room or some other methodology to highlight those EWPs that are impacting or could impact a CWP. Look at your VWPs. Are we getting the necessary spool, steel, equipment, etc., forecasted to arrive on time? We're not looking for just an overall commodity chart that shows so many 100,000 feet have been delivered. Is it the right pipe being delivered? Is it the right steel being delivered? Is that particular pump that we need arriving on time versus the overall purchase order for pumps, and this is their end date, rather than looking at the particular VWPs? Regulatory, it may not be an issue on most jobs, but if it is, you need to keep an eye on that. If the owner has got responsibility to manage that part or to interface with any kind of governmental entities or whatever, are they doing their part in a timely manner to make sure that those necessary answers are being generated or questions are being asked? Is that flow happening? Because those can definitely have an impact downstream to your CWPs. And then finally, design changes. Depending on the maturity of engineering, our DCNs, design change notices, starting to impact CWP starts. If they're arising after the CWP started, of course, you've got to bring extra pressure to bear for quick and effective closeout. You can't sit back and consider that, well, they only have so many engineers to do the work. No, we need to have these CWPs and these issues addressed immediately. So going back and tying into the resource curves, what do we need for specific EWPs that are already planned for, and then what kind of resources are needed to handle this load that's now developing in design changes. And again, I don't bring that up to make an attack on engineering at all. It's really about what's best for project to ultimately deliver it on time, right? Push for potential changes to be shared broadly rather than held close to the vest. What I mean by that is if there's an inkling that engineering is facing something or we're starting to see something develop in construction, hopefully by that time effective lines of communication have been opened up between the different teams, that we're able to share that information early. If we're able to look at those and talk about those design changes early, construction may be the right time to start resequencing some work. But again, not very early. Wait till enough engineering has been designed, enough information has been shared before you start making those commitments on the construction side, because that's where we tend to lose control of those budgets and time. We start trying to chase stuff where we're actually touching items 2, 3, or more times. Equipment starts moving back and forth over itself. We get into congestion efforts, typically things like that. So kind of as a wrap up, just beware of the temptation to assign other types of constraints. They might be thought of necessary, but they typically turn out to be log notes, right? Things that can be captured in the schedule for those white papers that we all write at the end. We're trying to gather information. If you start assigning too many constraints, you start bogging down your planners and your schedulers, and now they're not able to work their what-if scenarios and finding other ways around. They turn into paper pushers or note takers, and they're not doing the job that we need them to do. So Tanis, I don't know if you have anything you want to add there on constraint management, but those are definitely things that I've seen very important, and we ran the risk. Thank goodness we all got on the same page and were able to reduce and focus on what we believe are the big items that are going to affect the CWP, and not get bogged down with a bunch of other details.
No, I think that was well said, Joe. And if everything's important, nothing's important, right?
Right.
And it's really critical that we focus in on the things that are really going to move the needle and impact success downstream. And refining the focus on constraints is a great way to do that.
Yeah. So did any questions come up, Janice? Or?
We do have a few questions. Yeah, this one is a good one for you, Joe. I'll let you tackle this one. Can you supply an example of a win at Zachary with implementing AWP in engineering?
Oh, that is so. That's a good one. So for engineering with Zachary, we're still newer in that phase. We are starting some smaller projects, and AWP is being implemented in the engineering space within Zachary, but that's still new. So I can't think of one offhand right now. Construction, yes, but not the engineering phase just yet.
Yeah, absolutely, Joe. And I think you provided a good example earlier with the 4D simulations, right? We were doing some work with engineering, procurement, and construction, looking at downstream impacts, positive or things that needed to be addressed, and looking at refining this schedule to ensure that it was optimized. So I think that was a great example of using AWP through EP and C and seeing some positive outcomes there.
Now, to give maybe the other side of the coin, we were recently in a project, this would be now about 2 years ago, finished up for a major owner, and the engineering was done in a very good way. It was handed over from EWPs were already developed. The PWPs follow on, the equipment had already been procured and was shipped in that manner, and that did support the construction window. So it can be done, it has been done. But since the question specifically said Zachary, not in that space for engineering just yet that I know of.
Yeah, that's
okay.
Good. So, yep.
Sure.
So the next one is, you and I can tackle this one together. So implementing AWP at an EPC, do you ever worry about focusing too much on building packages and losing sight of execution? I think that's a fantastic question. One of the interesting points about the use of digital solutions in the industry is there's so much automation capability, right? And you really take a lot of the manual work out of the packaging exercise. But sometimes that automation can kind of push some bad behavior as well, right? And you can see packages being built quite quickly and scoping being done quite quickly. And sometimes people are focusing so much on just getting things packaged out that the execution details can be missed. And that's, really something that the industry has struggled with generally, and something that, Joe can speak to the practice of this. But it's something that his team does really well, is really focuses on the details of execution, because it's not just about scoping packages. I mean, yes, that's important, but it's about giving the right information to the execution team so they can be effective and they're not out there searching for things. So, getting the bill of materials at an IWP level, getting the task list together, all of that is important, but it's the details that matter, right? And if those details are missing, you're going to have somebody searching for something for hours that could have been addressed during the planning cycle. So, Joe, you can probably speak to the practice of that at an IWP level, but it's something your team does quite well. Is, even though automation provides a lot of great features and functionalities, making sure those execution details are in there to help facilitate successful delivery of that work package.
Yeah, I can't say any better than you had said, so I'll bring it in. I'll tack it on another area. We're, of course, we've been focusing on a mega project right now, but within Zachary, we are looking at, or we will be applying AWP to all ranges of projects, small cap, mid cap, and such. And if you're not careful there with your package generation, I think I'm seeing the tendency at times that we're going to create a CWP for every bit and part of work, because the original CII methodology had kind of limits on CWP size. What we're doing now is really spending that necessary time during the schedule generation phase, and really talking about what makes sense for this particular CWP. Take off those boundaries on the end that says it can only be X amount of hours or X amount of duration, but really what makes sense for how that construction team wants to construct it, so that they understand what's going to be in it. And then it makes it much more clear for engineering. And when we're faced with some of these smaller schedules and smaller SAS, I'm kind of floating the idea here, and maybe it strikes some thought here to the audience, is that we use some fewer and larger CWPs/EWPs so that package of work comes, there's more maybe confidence that you're going to get everything you need at that time, versus newer engineers, newer groups getting lost in hundreds of EWPs that actually could be duplicates in some case. They shouldn't be, but they may have a tendency to put some of the specification type documents in there rather than focusing on the work or the information that's needed for the constructor. And so again, I'm kind of floating the idea of really spending that time during the schedule development phase and the CWA, CWP scoping to see what makes sense for the constructor, the team that's going to build it. And that should help you kind of limit that time or over expending time on package development.
Yeah, great points, Joe. So this isn't a question, it's a comment, but advocating for the value of 4D, having similar experience with lost equipment instead of pipe hanging in midair. This was equipment hanging in midair with no structural steel to be seen. So it's certainly difficult to see in a Gantt chart filled with thousands or tens of thousands of line items. But once you see it in 4D, those schedule misses certainly stick out like a sore thumb. They're very easy to identify and address and correct, and you can ensure that you've got a solid schedule as a result.
So Tanis, I'll set it up for you also. Not only that, looking for those schedule misses as we're building a baseline schedule, but I recall several times that we took the current schedule with its forecast and run it against that baseline. And early on, we were able to see CWP starting to slip to the right and or come to the left. And then if we applied that same methodology, but to the EWP schedule, we're able to see things that are starting to get out of sequence as well. I think that's worth you adding maybe a little more comment there.
Absolutely, that's a great point, Joe. Those side-by-side animations are so valuable because you can watch the baseline playing back, and you can watch the current schedule, and you can see where you've got gaps or misses. So you can see plan versus actual performance and determine which areas you really need to focus attention on. You can do that. 4D is interesting because most teams really gravitate to construction, and it's very effective for construction execution, but you can also use 4D tools in engineering and procurement, get great visibility into what your plan was, what's actually happening, and then look at those simulations downstream to positively impact the schedule where you are experiencing hopefully early deliverables, and you can start looking at pulling things ahead. Or if you do have some late deliverables, you can look at mitigating risk before that risk materializes on the project. So it's a great point. So another question, what do you think is the most important thing when you were dealing with the owner, or what the owner should do to make your life easier?
So I'll answer it as the constructor, is maintain pressure on the E&P phase. Don't resist the temptation to jump to construction early. I think we all have a tendency to do that. We're looking at the end date, and it's typically construction, and then your startup and commissioning are sitting there at that back end. That's when all the great visual starts happening. We see things rising out of the ground. Everybody wants to jump to that phase because they feel that's where the real progress is happening. But again, the pressure and the spotlight needs to be kept upstream just to preserve that desired end state. A little bit of time and effort early on in that E&P phase, expediting in just the right spots, applying pressure for a particular EWP rather than across engineering as a whole, can provide great dividends downstream. We have, I said that one example of the valve, which was a year and a half ago. To be fair though, there's a lot of good folks in that owner organization that have jumped on board with us and really recognize now the value of AWP early up in that stream and the effects that it's providing downstream. So that would be the biggest thing I would suggest or urge an owner to do. Support us in that space there.
Yeah, great point, Joe. And if I can add to that, contract language is really important as well, right? Just sure. Making the general statement, do AWP, that doesn't really get us there. And expectations for different stakeholders can sometimes vary because AWP means different things to different groups. So as you start integrating stakeholders into a project, having good contract requirements and really having good understanding amongst project stakeholders around what's required, what AWP means to the project, and what everybody needs to be focused on is really beneficial to ensure that everybody's pushing in the same direction and working together very effectively. It's nice to see a lot of work going on around collaborative contracting. I think there's lots of opportunity in our space for development in contract language and contract requirements around AWP and just generally. So it's nice to see some work in that space. But development of contract language is really important as well from an owner standpoint.
Great point. Well, you know, Tanis, I think we're about out of time. It's 1:59, but I want to thank you for working on this with me. I always enjoy working with you, and I think we did a good job here as well.
Likewise, Joe, always a pleasure. And thanks so much to the attendees for joining us. Joe and I will be around. If you have any questions, please reach out to us through FeedLoop. You can connect with us there, or you'll find us on LinkedIn. Certainly reach out if you'd like to continue the conversation.
Thank you so much, you guys. That was a great presentation. Right now, we are going to a networking break. Feel free to reach out to either Joe or Tanis or some of the other presenters, as well as the other attendees. And we will see you back in the main room at 2:30. Take care, guys.
Thank you.